Hi, I'm Gareth Kane and welcome to the Net Zero Business Podcast. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Laura Elms, Vice President of Sustainability and Corporate Affairs at Forest, the London-based shared e-bike operator. Welcome to the podcast, Laura.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me on it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Now, before we get into the world of micromobility and shared e-bikes, we always ask how our guests got started in sustainability. Was there a particular moment that where they suddenly found themselves doing it as a career?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my route to sustainability was quite sort of non-linear, if you like, and probably would best be summarized as through the startup lens, I guess. When I joined Forest, I came in kind of cutting across quite a few different areas of the business. So I was on corporate partnerships. There was only four of us, so sort of part of the founding team. I was covering a lot of it. So yeah, as I said, corporate partnerships, communications, and also sustainability. So it was an opportunity to run with something. But when I look back now a little bit at how my career developed before I joined Forest, I started out after I graduated in financial communications and investor relations, which was a really interesting space to be in. I found myself, there was a particular moment where I was working on a client who was a large listed industrials company. And we were looking at how to get a bit of coverage for them outside of their traditional sort of financial reporting period. So as a quite junior person on the account, I was sort of tasked with trying to find some interesting stories on them. And I did a bit of a deep dive into some of their case studies they had around their top engineering projects. And when they built dams, they built channels basically in the dam for salmon to go up the river through. So I thought that was really, really fascinating. And I sort of came to the meeting really excited to talk about it. And I think quite a few people looked at me like they're not quite spot on what we're trying to do, like sort of a little bit off piste. So that was one of the times where I noticed that maybe my interest, and I really was deeply interested in it. I could have read, I think I read like a 3-pager about it, but I could have read 100 pages on it and still been interested. And then when I moved into the startup world after that role in an AI company, and I was focusing mainly again on the financial side, but a lot of it was in energy trading. And that was at a time when things were going from the traditional likes of the BPs, the Shell, the oil, the gas heavy, to diversify more into sort of renewables. So the development at the time was around sort of Ørsted, and companies like Statoil were rebranding to be Equinor and really investing in renewables. And again, I think I noticed at that point that where my interests lay were more in that sort of sustainable renewable space rather than the traditional. So I had a few hints of it, but really it was at Forest where I was able to sort of like take that and run with it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and was it the sustainable nature of Forest that attracted you to the role, or was it the startup side?
Yeah, a real combination, I think. So one of our founders is Caroline and Caroline Seaton, and I worked with her in that early role in investor relations. And so I had a good relationship with her, and we kind of carried that on long after I left the company. So on a personal level, I was interested in working with her again. But also the startup side. So I knew that I was more suited to that startup, quite fast-paced world. Mm-hmm. And then the final piece in the picture really was that sustainability piece, and knowing that there was a space to kind of make a big impact because there were only the four of us at the time. So I guess a real combination.
Yeah. So tell us about Forest. I suppose explain what the company does in your own words.
Yeah, I'd love to. So Forest is London's only sort of homegrown shared e-bike company. We only have bikes, so no scooters on the roads, and we've been operating since 2020. We've grown from about 200 bikes we had at the time when we first launched in 1 or 2 boroughs now to about 20,000 bikes across almost all of London, really. So you'll see our bikes everywhere. And we're really trying to get people out of carbon emitting modes of transport onto bikes and change the way people think about mobility. So yeah, that's in a nutshell what Forest is and what we're trying to do.
So how do you compete? Obviously when the what's now Santander bikes were colloquially known as Boris bikes still, even though that connection's always disputed, and then Line bikes get a lot of coverage. How do you break into a market where there's two big players already there?
Do you know what? Actually, at the time, there was a whole mix of people coming in, and we've seen lots of companies come in and out. So, in just before 2020, there was two others called Ofo and Mobike, and they were sort of, I would say, kind of plonked on the roads. It was quite that first generation was very it really was a bit of a wild west. People could just plonk the bikes on the roads and hope for the best. And it wasn't as electric in even those Boris bikes. A lot of them still, are getting that to that space. So the first generation we saw was quite sort of rough around the edges, really, I'd say. And the regulation was really far behind on it. And then when we came in, actually, there was Jump and Lime, and they merged. And then we've had Dot and Tier, who joined the market in sort of maybe 2021, 2022, and have left. And now we have also Voy and Bolt. So actually the market's been in a huge evolution of just in the time that we've been operating and just prior to that. So the market has been busy, and it hasn't just been sort of Lime and us and Santander. It's been a lot more colourful than that. So it's always been a sort of bit of a competitive space and trying to find out where your brand fits amongst the others. I think there's a big difference between the Santander or Boris bikes and the shared dockless e-bikes. I mean, just by virtue of having the docks, but also Santander has been limited to sort of tracking the river line a little bit. So their geographic spread has been kind of a lot more centred in London. I think Lime, I mean, they're just very different from us in terms of a company. They have about, I think, over 170 cities. We're only in London. They've grown very quickly. They're backed by Uber. We're a relatively small company. We're only centred on London. We've always focused on London. And our approach has been to grow quite slowly, sustainably, and not kind of overshoot the mark, if you like. So that's sort of our main differentiator now. But I think the sustainability piece is a big one as well in terms of our brand, and why we polled our customers recently, or our users, and they point to sustainability as a key driver for why they would pick our bikes as opposed to our peers, and that's quite reassuring as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Mobike, because I live in Newcastle upon Tyne. We had Mobikes, and they just suddenly disappeared once. And they owe me 50 pence to this day, and I'll never forget it. But I liked the Mobike. They had no gears. They weren't e-bikes, but my main thing about liking them is, I'm sort of the archetypal middle-aged man in Lycra cyclist who has not terribly expensive, but I've got a couple of bikes out of shot here, which I keep inside because I don't want anybody to steal them. And I won't leave them on a Sheffield stand in the middle of town, whereas a Mobike, that was the main thing for me. But they just disappeared overnight, and there've been lots of schemes have come and gone. And do you have a feel for why some of them work and some of them have failed?
Yeah, I mean, I think hardware is hard. Like, it's hard to run a company with such a focus on hardware, and hardware that gets used in a shared capacity. I think we're getting to a much more normal space with that concept of shared economy. It was a real shame to see Zipcar leave recently, but I do think it's become a lot more normal. So even when I look at the way sort of Gen Zs are thinking about what products they use, it's a lot more about picking up a shared item, whatever it might be. It might even be, I don't know, a baby stroller. They'll share it for a few years, they'll give it back, they'll rent it. That model has taken off a lot more. I think you have to have a good asset. So the actual product itself has to be hard wearing. People sometimes, or in the past certainly, complained about the heaviness of our bikes, and actually that is part of their resilience. We need a level of that, particularly in London, where not just the weather, which is challenging. So over winter, obviously things get a lot trickier in terms of maintenance of the bikes, but also thinking about the road structure and it not being a sort of typical grid. We don't have a coherent cycle infrastructure across all the boroughs that makes it just easy for people to understand. They go and they use the bikes and they get sort of worn. But I also think it was at a stage where investment was geared towards that sort of spray and pray approach of open loads of cities and see what happens. And very rarely, I think, in companies does it really work to scale that quickly, because you need to be focusing on your users, the quality of the bikes, but also a big part around the regulation. You know, we operate in the public space, so you need to be focusing on what that specific city needs and not sort of spreading yourself too thinly. And I think that has been a problem with quite a lot of the operators over time.
Oh yes, there's lots there that I could unpick. I'm almost 3 years into a car-free experiment,
Right.
and I depend on Co-Wheels Car Club for when I need a car, and I've got an electric cargo bike, and Micromobility would, as I say, fit another component of that. And obviously, I'm Gen X, not Gen Z. I'm a long way from Gen Z, but it is an interesting thing what you talk about when Zipcar pulled out, then that's going to leave a gap for a lot of people who are trying to do what I am doing, and we are reliant on these services. And again, when Mobike fell, that was a sort of a bit of a grumble on my part. But for some reason, I haven't signed up to the scooter scheme that we have got here. I think again, it's a bit of pro cycling prejudice, but it's just is trying to formulate this question: is who is your, I suppose, your target market? Is it tourists? Is it commuters? Is it people who just want to pop to the pub and don't want to leave their bike chained up outside, like me?
Yeah, and also don't want to have to sort of cycle home after a few drinks. They could leave it there. It's a really good question. And again, I mean, I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's changed a lot since when we started, because the industry's evolved and it's become a much more normal part of the transport mix. So it used to be, and particularly during the pandemic, we saw a lot of leisure riding. People getting out and about. Actually, nowadays, I think 64% of our users or riders say that they use our bikes for commuting or traveling to meetings. So that's a big, big part. And I think it's become a lot more solidified in the transport mix. I also think that our bikes are very good for a mixed mode mobility, so getting that last mile or the first mile, or complicated areas that aren't very well serviced by other transport means. So there's a real mix across a lot of different areas now. It's not a sort of one size fits all. I also think it's changed, our demographics changed. So again, when there's like a new technology, often it is younger people that pick them up and give them a try, because as well, you have to have a level of sort of like confidence with the app and all that, and that typically tends to be younger people that pick them up. But as we've seen, even the last 6 years go by, it's changed massively. I mean, we have a lot more now actually in middle aged than we necessarily do in younger users as well. So I think things are evolving and there's no one size fits all. But what I would say from what I've seen over the last 6 years or so is it's gone from much more niche to much more mainstream. We have huge influxes of bikes going into the city of London every morning. So from outer parts of London, we also have it, seeing it come back again at rush hour. So I think commuting has really taken on quite a dominant space in it recently.
Yeah, and I think, am I right that all your bikes are e-bikes?
That's right. They're all e-bikes. Yeah.
Yeah, which brings, sorry.
The other thing to add there is when the strikes happened, actually, we saw it being used and that was in sort of September, I think, last year. Yeah. Our ridership went up massively, and I guess that was for pretty much all use cases. But we also have, partnerships with the likes of delivery companies that they can use our bikes as well. So there is a real cross-cutting section now that use our shared e-bikes.
Yeah, because obviously the e-bikes open up a much broader ridership, not only just physical, but the thing of not turning up at the meeting soaking in sweat. If you've got a hill or a headwind.
You say that, but I've actually brought I've had it for quite a long time now. I've got a cargo bike, and I like that it's not, because it's like my one opportunity to get a bit of a sweat on. My kids in the front and feel like I'm actually burning a bit of energy.
Yeah, I've got a Turn GSD cargo bike, just as I say, just over there. But that's a whole another topic. I love cargo bikes, but No, if I want to get a sweat on, I get on my gravel bike or my road bike. um, so the other thing, there was talk at the time of, you mentioned OFO and Mobike who failed. There was talk at that time, there was a lot of money coming in, and the investors were hoping to sort of monetize the data coming back
Mm.
from the, the usage data. And I never got a chance to to dig into that. But is that part of your business model? Are you looking at you know life patterns and things, and providing that data to other people in one form or another? I'm not saying you're spying on your customers, but you know
No,
what I mean? Yeah,
yeah, everything's in line with, obviously, with GDPR and
yeah,
regulations. I mean, what we do use it for is to inform the boroughs that we work with
yeah.
on where would be sort of needed parking. So looking at spaces where typical routes, typical parking hotspots, to try and inform how they go about considering infrastructure and where it's needed in the boroughs. So that's definitely a really good use case of looking at our rides. In terms of people, we don't sort of look at their habits so much, but obviously there's an interesting part again on that demographic. So we poll users quite often on, why do you use our bikes? If you didn't use our bikes, what other transport mode would you have picked? So that's really interesting to explore a bit more on modal shift and how much we're getting people out of cars and other sort of more carbon intensive forms of mobility, or are we changing people's habits and they're not walking so much, which has been quite a criticism of the sector. If you get into that sort of sustainability thought area, so that's kind of more where we use data rather than sort of focusing on users and their interests or habits.
Or any commercialization. And then you mentioned the boroughs, and London's got 32 independent boroughs.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't want to be asked this question. I can see the stress already. But what are the issues there? Obviously, you'll find some easier to work with than others. But what could they do to help?
Yeah, I mean, London is so unique. I mean, in many, many ways. But for us, the main nuance of it is that, unlike sort of every other major city, Paris, any Barcelona, they don't think of it coherently. It's not come under one regulatory system. It's all managed. We manage our relationships borough by borough,
Mm.
and they all have different ways of operating and ways that they want us to operate. So whether that's based on a sort of more formal procurement process and a tender, or whether it's based on a sort of more flexible MOU process, it's all hopefully coming under the English Devolution Bill, and the power to regulate it will be coming under TfL within the next few years. So that's currently sort of running through the parliamentary stages. That will join everything up into a much more coherent, user-friendly, easy to operate system, where 1, 2, 3 operators will get sort of selected to run a scheme across the city. And the challenge at the moment has been for us to work with so many different stakeholders and so many different boroughs. What is safety to one, and we will get scored on the safety element, might not be safety on the sort of priority on the other, but also even thinking about the financial contributions, the voluntary financial contributions that we would give to each borough. There's no ombudsman looking over across them and saying, like, here's the limit. And so it becomes a very competitive market, and also a very complicated market for users. I mean, when it comes to something practical like parking, one borough might really prefer that free floating model where you can leave the bikes on the streets, particularly if it's a borough like Richmond, for example, where pavements are maybe wider. And then you go to the City of London or Camden, they have a much stricter policy, or Westminster, on wanting to have them in fixed parking bays. And so for the user to understand, okay, now I've crossed over this invisible line from Camden into Islington, so therefore I have to park like this, it's really challenging. And that also comes with then a lot of criticism around how our users leave the bike. So once that piece comes into fruition, I think it will help a lot the industry mature and us become just a kind of part of the mix, and less sort of controversial in some ways.
Yeah. And he mentioned as well, whether or not micromobility replaces people driving, or whether it replaces people walking, or public transport, or whatever. So when you publish carbon savings, what assumptions do you make? How do you calculate it?
So that's based on, I think it's approximately 11% of people would say that if they hadn't taken our bikes for a ride, they would have either chosen taxi or their own car. But when we make those, then sort of extrapolate that out into the carbon savings, which I'm always a little bit resistant to do too much with because it is so theoretical. Mm-hmm. We also look at how, so for example, how many of the cars in London are what proportion of them are now electric and what proportion of them are fuel. We have to use loads of open source data to sort of get to that end figure to make it as accurate as possible. I think it sort of misses the point a little bit. I mean, people like to have that, oh, you saved X amount of CO2. Personally, I'm not really sure why, because I mean, I don't even know how many like hot air balloons that is. Like, it's very hard to conceptualize what that CO2 saving is. And it's not like someone sitting there and saying, oh, well, they've saved that much, but I know that that company saves X amount more, because you just don't, not many people have those numbers in the back of their heads. So I do find that argument a little bit stayed. Like, I think we could maybe move on from that a little bit and make it a bit more practical. Like, what's really happening here? It's not when perfection is the enemy of good. Yes, some people might be moving away from walking trips to get on a bike. I mean, I would like to think they're not, but they might be. But really what's happening is that we're changing the way people look at mobility, and that there are other options. And also slightly, I like to think, like, democratizing cycling a little bit. It has been a space which has been I think a bit closed off to some people, and actually having bikes on the roads that are really quite straightforward to ride. They're not even very challenging physically to ride. You know, you don't have to be super fit to get on one of the bikes. If you have a hill, it's not that intimidating because you've got the electric assist. So I think it's easier to think of it more as a long-term move away from some mobility habits and into something a little bit more creative, rather than thinking it's literally saving this much CO2, because that is quite questionable. I think you could pick holes in it a lot, even if we're asked to provide it often.
Yeah, because again, thinking back to when I used mobikes, it was probably quite often times I would have walked, but you know, I was saving 20 minutes by hopping on a mobike rather than walking. And I saw a study somewhere that on the electric scooters, that if you own an electric scooter, it'll displace motorized transport. But if you hire an electric scooter, it's marginal whether or not you're just it's an alternative to walking.
Yeah, I think the electric scooters, their speed is capped, I think, a bit lower than ours. So it takes quite a long time to get places, I think, on a scooter. It's not actually very active in and of itself. You know, you're not actually doing anything. So we've never been interested really in that scooter piece. But also, when you look at the scooters and the amount of times that they're used per day, it's very low relative to the bikes. So the scooters are sort of taking up quite a lot of the space in some respects, the infrastructure. They've got the bays fixed for them. But they're getting, I mean, I think times we're getting three rides per day per bike. I think on scooters it's about 0.3, so it's a big difference in usage.
I would assume that was the other way around, because you know, you don't have to put any effort into the scooter and all the rest of it. I thought
yeah, I mean, bear in mind this is London, so I'm not sure elsewhere, but I think bikes do seem to have become a more trusted kind of vehicle.
So sort of moving on then to your own sustainability performance, you market yourselves as the most sustainable. The London bike share things. How do you pitch that if somebody says, you know, justify that?
Does that really mean? So from the outset, we started by doing B Corp from the very beginning, which gave us such a good framework for understanding as a startup actually what you can do to be really good, and not necessarily perfect, but go as far as you can. So one of the easy wins for us was, right, let's make sure that every battery that's charged is charged with renewable energy. And now a lot of the companies that existed before us and are larger than us, they say they are moving to it, but it's very hard to get a sort of figure on whether it's 100% or not, or get a sort of feel for whether it's 100% or not. But then also, okay, what happens behind that? Is it when we have people doing battery swaps, so they go out in vans, what vehicle are they driving? Some of our competitors, it could actually be outsourced to a freelance. It could be in any car, but ours, it's in electric vehicles, electric vans, and they are charged with renewable energy. And that is a huge part of it. It's also working with our the manufacturer of the bikes to see how they can reduce down their emissions. So when we look at our emissions, it's almost entirely scope 3 emissions. And so doing that piece on the supply chain is really important. Our manufacturer, they have started using solar energy to put in the production of the bike. So not necessarily the bike parts, but in putting them all together. So that's a big step as well. We also did a really interesting project a few years ago. I think it was about a year, 2 to 3 years ago, where we looked at, rather than some of our competitors in the space will use the same bike as us. It comes from the same manufacturer. So instead of buying new bikes, we sought out competitors' bikes which they didn't want anymore. So they were actually unused. So there was no sort of concerns around safety of the product. Unused bikes that they weren't able to use, and we incorporated them into our fleet, which was a really fun and interesting project. They were a completely different color to our bikes, so our designer was sort of in pieces, and we had to get our heads together and think, well, how are we going to get, we've just done this sort of brand piece around being dark green, that kind of quite British feel of the bikes, all around sustainability, and these bikes were bright blue, really bright blue. Now, if we repainted them, stripped them all back, it's a big process, it's an expensive process, and it's definitely not a sustainable process. So instead we decided to try and incorporate them into the fleet. So we did like a 9-month, I think it was, or maybe a year partnership with the Rivers Trust. So 5% of anything made from those bikes, the river bikes that were on the roads, went to the Rivers Trust, and we tried to sort of make a kind of make a thing of it that way, kind of creatively. And then when we got to the end of that project, we tried to incorporate them by basically blending them in with so we made it into like an earth bike. So the blue became the ocean, the green became the land, and it kind of fitted into the brand a bit better. So that was really interesting and fun and creative, and saved so much in terms of emissions from just the production of the bikes themselves. It's not necessarily like a forever strategy, because those, the secondhand market for unused bikes is quite limited. And obviously we've got to make sure that they're the assets at top quality that we can get. But it was a fun one, and it's definitely not been done in the sector since or beforehand. So it was definitely sort of spearheading an interesting project in that sense. And then although offsetting has a bit of a bad name, we offset with a really local partner. So it's an organisation in the UK called the Great Reserve that plants sequoia trees, and we go and we visit and we plant them ourselves. It's not some far-flung sort of offsetting scheme. So whilst obviously reducing emissions is sort of top priority, actually we do offset, but we offset well with a good project.
Yeah, well, I was again, there's masses of questions that spin out of all that. But picking up on the last bit, because I was looking through your sustainability report just before we started, and first question was sequoias. That's interesting, but why go for a non-native tree?
Yes, good. So I'm not sure I'm going to do this justice if I describe it, but in the history of the UK, if you look back millions of years ago, they do find that the sequoia was actually originally here. Now that's a bit like sort of passing the buck, because you can never really test that out. But what they also do is they put the sequoias on already felled land, and they also plant, I think it's 3 native trees for every 1 sequoia tree, to obviously encourage biodiversity. So there's a few sort of aspects to that, but also that just the fact that the redwoods have gone on to the endangered species list in North America because of wildfires. So there is an opportunity to sort of bring them back, if you like, to the UK and sort of help them. And it's amazing to see them grow. We have literally seen them grow just over the 2 years that we've been doing it, and it's extraordinary the rates that they grow.
Yeah, so you say you've been doing it for 2 years. I was wondering if you chose the company name to match the offsetting or vice versa, but
Vice versa. So we actually, the company name was originally Human Forest, and that was because our CEO and one of the three founders, he previously worked at Cabify, and Cabify obviously is also in mobility, but it was the first to offset its emissions with a project in the Amazonas. So he was running Cabify in Latin America, and so he wanted to see how he could use humans, if you like, traveling around to reduce the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So humans making, in a sense, a forest that hold the CO2. So that was where that came from. But we did loop back to that idea of the forest, and we did an amazing sort of marketing thing, which I'll send to you afterwards. That's on YouTube, of one of our team cycling one of our e-bikes all the way from London to Wales, where the Sequoia Grove is, and following him on that journey. And then we actually got the bike up. It's on a mountain, this site, or not a mountain, but a big hill. And so we managed to get this like 35-kilo bike up the side of the hill. It was quite fun.
yes, I can imagine having pushed a 30
Yeah.
kilo cargo bike about through sometimes muddy tracks and things. So, as you say, you've reduced your scope one, scope two
Yeah.
emissions to pretty much zero by pretty much electrifying everything, and presumably that you're purchasing green grid electricity rather than having, or do you have? Shouldn't assume. Maybe you do have a massive solar array, or
I wish we did, but
yeah,
no.
no, it's purchasing green electrons. And then in your sustainability strategy, you talk about scope three incompressible emissions as a
Mm.
target. So perhaps you could unpick that for us.
Yeah, I think it's trying to get it. So net zero, I got a bit caught up in what net zero really means for a company like us. And for me, it's now trying to prove that we have reduced things as far as we can while still being a small company that is growing. And I think that's where sometimes we get kind of caught up a little bit. There, when I look at our peers or others in the market that have started from kind of a low benchmark, they have these wonderful graphs of showing progress towards net zero, but it's starting from such a high rate, whereas was such a fraction of it from the beginning. We never powered our bikes with anything but renewable energy, so, well, from the grid. So it's trying to frame that as how we are still making great progress despite growing. I mean, maybe we will open new markets. We haven't got any plans to at the moment, but if we do, we need a lot more bikes to do so. And if so much of our scope three emissions are in the production of the bikes, then inherently our footprint's actually going up, not down. So it's thinking about those intensity metrics. One of them is CO2 sort of per bike, if you like.
Mhm.
And CO2 per kilometer ridden. So that's looking as well at like sort of the lifespan of the bikes and how long they go on for. So that's where we're moving to. I mean, I think in terms of tangible priorities, the batteries are interesting. It's really tricky to think about the battery space, and that the battery point almost proves to me the importance of regulation across our whole industry, because what we need for that London piece to really come together and to run a really good scheme is that one piece of regulation on micromobility, shared micromobility. And what we're seeing with batteries is that they're doing that. It is coming from the EU and they're pushing ahead. And it's almost like the proper recycling and repair facilities for bike batteries aren't really there until that regulatory piece comes in and the innovation, and hopefully capital flows to it. And then there's innovation and we'll have a better solution for that. So one of the big things I think to think about is batteries. The other one is actually tech. And I was looking at our scope three, and I think it's diversifying a little bit. You know, when we have solar powering the manufacturing of the bikes, it's going down in that production space, but actually technology is taking up a lot more. And I'm interested to know, and I don't yet really know the answer to this, is whether our partner Greenly, who we work with, it's just becoming more accurate, the amount of CO2 that they're attributing to the use of tech within companies,
Mhm.
or whether we're actually using more. So I think that's another big space that we could look at doing a bit more and trying to reduce them down. Yeah.
So when you say tech, do you mean the electronics going into the bike, or are you talking about the technology to manage the app and?
I was thinking more the technology to manage the app. So all of our software, anything that we use like that. I think it's been I think, and again, I haven't really done the research on it yet, but I think it's been underrepresented how much that is taking up in scope 3, and so it's getting more accurate. And I don't know what mitigating factors we can use really to suppress that or to kind of reduce it, but we need to think a bit creatively about that, as I think most companies do at the moment. The use of ChatGPT in companies, that's going, or AI more broadly, that's going up a lot. I wonder what impact that's having, the footprint of that.
Yeah, yeah, and that's one of the big questions of the moment. Almost every episode we do in the podcast, somehow we get to AI at some
AI.
point, and the implications of it. So I was just wondering, do you have an idea? We were talking about the carbon savings, and I know you may not want to go there, but just in broad terms, the carbon savings you're making for your customers, do those exceed the carbon emissions of providing the service?
I think, yeah, again, it's one that I've never really wanted to sort of delve too far into, because I think it opens yourself up for quite a lot of criticism about whether the bikes, if you look at just a normal pedal bike, that definitely would, right? But when you add a battery in and 35 kilos, it's harder to understand. And it's also, for us, we've only been around for 5 years. So how long will those bikes exist for?
Mm-hmm.
So I think yes, I think it's gonna be my answer. It's a bit of a cop out answer, but I can't see why the schemes as a whole, it can't be considered that when people take rides on them, it's taking away from carbon emitting modes of transport. And we have got a modal shift sort of calculation, but it's tricky to put into each individual's ride. Obviously, that depends on sort of like the length of the ride, how long that bike's been in the fleet for, and so on.
Yeah. And how long well, maybe you don't know yet. Maybe you haven't got any end of life bikes yet. I don't know. How long do the bikes last?
So currently, we actually don't have any end of life bikes. So we have bike frames that we sort of are thinking about how we reincorporate them or get them back to the manufacturer. But we've done a huge piece in the repair and the refurbishment project to kind of keep our bikes going. And interestingly, I was speaking to our research and development teams this week, and they said that the bikes that get sort of the highest performance scores, if you like, when you ask users after a ride, are actually not the new ones that have just come out and been put on the streets. It's the ones that have been stripped back completely and re-put back together and sort of given a new lease of life. They score much more highly. So I think that's a really interesting piece. We started a refurbishment project back in 2022, I think it was, and since then we've gone from 60% of the bike parts being able to be recycled and reused and put back on the bikes to 73%, and hoping to get that up to 80% by 2030. So I think there's a big part of that, and it also combats any sort of planned obsolescence, which I think you can assume that in a hardware in a company where hardware is super important, that planned obsolescence can be an issue. So it's a way of sort of mitigating a lot of those factors as well. In terms of actual lifespans, it was 5 years, I think we assumed, but I think we can sort of start creeping up towards the 10-year mark. We're doing like an intense LCA of the bike this year, so that will give a bit more of a concrete understanding of the life cycle emissions of the bike as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Just from sort of trying to keep a family's worth of bikes on the roads, I do think the urban use tends to be quite light on them compared to what I do, which costs me a lot of money every year, but that's another matter. Kill my bikes. So you've mentioned a couple of projects. Is there anything else that you're particularly proud of? You were talking about the whole thing with the going to the offsetting site and your other work. But is there any other particular area of your operations that you're pleased that you've done something in sustainability terms that you think is above and beyond the normal call?
Yeah, I mean, I think the real one for us was that river bikes project, which I think I covered a bit earlier. It was kind of it was amazing in the sense that it covered sustainability, operations, finance, CSR, and design all in one project. And I think for me, in a company that's still growing and still sort of startup, maybe high growth, I guess you'd say, maybe medium-sized business. But we're at that tricky stage. I think they call it the Series B, Series C sustainability cliff, where actually sustainability becomes a lot harder to financially justify, a lot harder to actually make happen because you're operationally a lot bigger. And there's a lot more risk associated with it than when you're tiny and there's not too much to it. And despite that, when we went and did the river bike sort of project, it was really, really fun. It was fun. It was interesting. And also it gave back to the Rivers Trust, which I think was a really great organization to work with. So that one for me was like the real sort of peak of sustainability at Forest so far.
That sounds like something that would inspire employees as well.
Yeah, we got everyone in the rivers doing a river clear up in southeast London as well. So it sort of brought the teams together a little bit on one of those days. And that's what also we do with the Great Reserve. We try and make sure we get the teams there every year, plant them, check up on the old ones. And it's a trip to Wales. So it's quite a lot of fun. Go for a pub lunch afterwards, brings everyone together talking about it and bringing it to life, making it a bit more tangible than things like this CO2 figure of how much we save. That's just so sort of...
Yes, what's in scope 3 and what's not is not the most inspiring conversation to have, is it? And you mentioned B Corp, and you mentioned it in a positive sense, but some people, there seems to be a few people drifting away from B Corp and finding it a bit onerous for what they get out of it. But I'm assuming you do find that it a useful exercise.
Yeah, I think I can understand the criticisms. I think that they've changed it now, actually, so that I think the process is slightly different. They've got like a new framework. But when we started out, it was when B Corp wasn't quite one of those things where you saw the logo on every sort of nut bar that you buy in Tesco or whatever. But it was a little bit less out there than now. I think they had a few problems around particularly Brewdog, and it brought the reputation down quite a lot. I maintain though that it is a really good framework if you do it honestly and you go through it and you are considered about it. It's a really good framework for keeping you on track. And again, it comes back to that. It was really useful when we were first starting out because it gave me, there were only like sort of 4 or 5 of us, it gave us this framework for like, right, if we do this, we know we're doing all right, we've got everything covered, and you can build on that. Then we've come back around and we've recently recertified. We got a slightly higher score, which is again really good for a company that is growing in that high growth stage. But it brings you back to where you need to be. So that Series B, Series C sort of cliff where a lot of companies fall off the radar and the investors become, the priority and things shift and, unit economics becomes the big thing rather than thinking about the sustainability. It keeps you there, keeps you sort of like grounded and checking in on what you're doing. So I guess it depends a little bit how you use it. But for us, I've always found it a useful exercise to make sure that we're all on the same trajectory and the same mission.
And externally, do other stakeholders, particularly our customers or potential customers, do they understand B Corp? Do they recognize it and say that's good, or is it just another badge?
They do, actually. They do. And that was what was also brought up in that survey where we looked at our riders and why they pick us. And we put it on the bikes as well. So on those Earth bikes where the bike itself looked a bit like planet Earth and we had sort of continents of green, we highlighted this is where we plant trees to try and make it really clear. It's also a differentiator with our competitors, so the others aren't. I think there's sort of one other in the space that they're not in London that's a B Corp, so it is a differentiator to our sector peers, and it is something that even just if you spent the time to go and do it and invested the money into it, that shows to me and probably to a lot of other consumers that it's something that you prioritize and gives some sort of cultural sort of signal, I guess, a little bit. I mean, whether it makes a huge difference when you think about pricing and all those other factors, but it's certainly not disregarded, and it's certainly not frowned upon when it comes to sort of the regulatory space as well, which is reassuring from our perspective.
Absolutely. I could keep talking about micromobility and bikes forever, but we only have a limited amount of time. So just kind of to sum up, if you decided to move on to another role somewhere completely different, and you were briefing your replacement. What advice would you be giving them?
Well, I actually have. I'm not moving on, but I have just hired someone into the team to focus on sustainability and give it a bit more of a lease of life. I think I think a lot gets mixed up in the language of sustainability, where it all becomes a bit, like I said, a bit intangible and not very real. And we're sort of aiming for perfection. We want to see that graph go really neatly down.
Mm.
So I think one thing I would say is you might not see that graph go neatly down, but if you're broadly speaking on the right path, thinking about how we shape behavior in better ways, thinking about our supply chain and how we influence them, and having a more holistic view of it, it's a healthier space than to become kind of obsessive with getting certain numbers which don't really mean that much, or certain phrases as a tick box exercise. And how do you actually do that? Like how do you keep that in your head when you've also got to write a sustainability report and you've got to calculate XYZ? I think a lot of it comes down to creativity. So like not getting so polar focused on producing the sustainability report, but actually thinking, right, how do I bring our brand into this? How do I get our finance team into this? If we do this LCA properly, what does it mean for the financial team, the marketing team? Looking at it more broadly will do you much better than being sort of laser focused in on the sort of buzzwords and the numbers, which don't always actually make much of a difference to the end result, which is hopefully getting the user onto a bike rather than an emitting mode of transport, and B, our bikes, which are better than the competitors.
So outward looking, not inward looking, I think would be if I could summarize that possibly in a few words, but I absolutely agree, and well done getting the little pitch in there for forest bikes as well. Next time I'm down in London, I will definitely be keeping an eye out for them, although often I take my own bike down. So, as I say, that was absolutely fascinating. We covered a huge amount of ground. I think people listening to this will have learned a huge amount both about micromobility and the whole sort of startup and the issues around that. And we talked about emissions and offsetting and B Corps as well. So and of course importantly the final thing about that sort of holistic approach and making sure you're talking to everybody and not just in this little sustainability echo chamber. So that just leaves me to thank you very much for joining us today, Laura.
Thank you for having me. It's been great to chat.